Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and we have another deck creation video. This one comes from Lexa, who is asking to make a Goblin Charbelcher deck. Goblin Charbelcher, of course, is an artifact that cares about the number of lands you have in your deck. And if you've played Modern recently, which I hope you have, it's a wonderful format, we have a Goblin Charbelcher deck that's currently made by running no lands because all of the lands are MDFCs. That means that there are lands on the back and spells on the front, which allows you to effectively have a landless deck. With that in mind, Lexa was wondering if we could do the same thing in Commander, with MH3 putting, I believe, three more at least into each of the colors, 2 uncommon and 1 hybrid. There is an additional amount of MDFCs that we can use to run this Charbelcher deck with no lands, without suffering too much from the common kind of problems of trying to run a deck like this. And I think the result is pretty fun. I worked really hard and there's been a lot of silly fun things I've enjoyed about making this deck. So before we get any further, let's look at the commander I've chosen, and let's look at the deck itself. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So this is a Breya Ethereum Shaper deck. But like I said before, this is a Goblin Charbelcher deck, so I think it's better to look at the Goblin Charbelcher first and talk about how it works in Commander. Goblin Charbelcher is a 4 mana artifact with a 1 ability that's 3 mana and tap it to activate. It says reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. And then it will deal damage equal to the number of non-land cards revealed this way to target creature or player. You do have to pick the target before you activate it. Now, there is an additional thing that says if it's a mountain, it'll deal double damage, but we're not running lands, so that doesn't particularly matter. Then there's another bit of text that says put the revealed cards on the bottom of the library in any order. Now, when you do this with no lands in your deck, something interesting happens. Well, primarily, you do take out a player. Assuming you have anywhere, like 70, 80 cards, probably 60 cards left at least, in your deck, and your opponents have less than that in health, you can basically pick an opponent and take them out of the game. But as you do this, one, you're going to reveal the entirety of your deck to all your opponents. In practical effects, if you're not online, the easiest way to do that is to physically hand your deck to your opponents and tell them if they'd like they can look through it. With that in mind, the weird part is that once the deck is emptied and there's no land found, you still have to do that last step that says put the revealed cards on the bottom of your library in any order. Now, since the entirety of your deck is in your hands and the entirety of the deck is going to go on the bottom of the library, you get to actually pick every single order of every single card in your deck. Now, is this practical? I would argue probably not in most cases. You might pick like the top 5 or the top 10, but beyond that, you don't particularly care. In like 60 card formats, when you have one opponent, this just usually beats them, so you never have to worry about reorganizing your entire deck. But in Commander, when you take out one of your 3 opponents, you get to then prepare for the next 2. What I would probably consider this to be is a really kind of fancy vampiric tutor, because after the first few cards of your deck, it's not really going to matter which order you put all the cards out, but like, maybe this is a skill issue where I fundamentally can't do this thing and other players can. If you have the skill to order 100 cards in a specific order quickly and without annoying your opponents, I think you can do it and I'd be very impressed. But for me, I would probably pick 5, 6 cards, put them on top, shuffle the rest, and move on. So this is like the signature spell or the signature move of the deck. Let's look at the commander that I've chosen for this, and I picked Breya. Now, the first thing about Breya is that she's 4 colors, which is kind of fundamentally why I thought of Breya to start with. You see, with each color having only so many MDFCs that I would say are playable, we are limited in the number of colors we get to play. because if we play like monocolor or two color, we just do not have a particularly good land base. In four color, I'm playing every MDFC we can, and we just hit, I think, 39, 38 cards around there in MDFCs, which is really, really good if you ask me for a deck of this quality. And that's still including a tremendous amount of tap lands. I think there's an argument to be made that this deck could be 5 colors. That way you add at least 3 more lands that come in untapped, and you add another 4 lands that are dual lands but come in tapped. And I think that's pretty good. That's a good argument to make. But even that being said, I don't think green is the color I want to be playing in a deck like this, because one of green's main interaction points is land ramp, tutoring, you know, like pulling lands out of your deck onto the battlefield. And though cards that allow you to play multiple lands will still allow you to play multiple MDFCs in a turn, the search and the ramp function doesn't work in a deck without lands. Now, green has a lot more that I could add into a deck like this, and I'm not going to say that, you know, there's nothing that green could bring in, but I thought green was the easiest one to cut, and that left us with 4 colors. Now, Breya was the first commander I thought of. There is a second commander, but I'm going to leave that to the end of the video to talk about. But Breya here, I think, functions really well as just a decent commander that does a good job with what the deck wants to do. She is 4 colors minus green, legendary artifact human 4/4. When she enters the battlefield, she creates 2 1/1 blue Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying, and then she has 1 activated ability, where you pay 2 mana, sacrifice 2 artifacts, and then you choose one of the following 3. Either she does 3 damage to target player or planeswalker, she gives a creature -4/-4, or you gain 5 life. I would be pretty confident that her second ability is by far the strongest one. Being able to just take creatures out for 2 artifacts and 2 mana is really, really impressive, and I think followed carefully behind by the gaining 5 health. Though I don't particularly like it, this deck doesn't really have ways to gain life, and just having access to something like that can be nice if you're starting to get to that red line where you're worried about your health and you have mana and artifacts to spare. That final, I say final, but like first ability of being able to do 3 damage to a player or planeswalker, I don't think really comes up. This deck's Ace in the Hole is like an instant defeat combo, and though we have some burn in here, or like some damage over time kind of effects, I don't think the 3 damage for 2 mana and 2 artifacts is really going to be worth it. So with that in mind, I think Breya is cool, but I'm mainly interested in that middle ability to start using her as removal. Looking at the deck list itself, if you have pulled it open from the description down below, it looks something like this. And this is fundamentally incredibly difficult to look at, and I apologize, because a lot of our regular factors of how we evaluate a deck are somewhat inaccessible at this point. It's like, interestingly enough, we can go and we can look at the curve, and the curve is just objectively not correct, right? Where not only are a lot of these cards lands, they would just never be cast on this, you know, on this meta point in game, right? They're just being played. And we have some weird percentage chance of playing these on curve elements on these. I think notably it's because that the MDFCs count as 100% chance to play them. Oh, but not always. That's strange. When I was first building the deck, it did give me 100% most of the time. I'm not going to worry too much about it. So we can't really look at the mana curve, and looking at the deck list itself is very difficult. So I would suggest that if you open this up, you click type and tags, which will show that I have regulated all of these MDFCs into what I call the land section, showing we have 38 lands. There's probably a few more we could consider here, from Treasure Map to Everflowing Well to Search for Azkentha, but they cannot be just played on their land side, so I am counting them as not lands. Even then, it still makes it kind of difficult to see exactly what the curve is and what we're doing, so we have to work with kind of what we have. And what do we have? So let's talk about primarily the mindset I had about this deck and how I got it to where it is. I think there's a lot of arguments we can say for, like, I can just give you the list and you can kind of figure it out, but this was an interesting deck building challenge. Imagine a deck where the majority of your lands are like basics in the sense they'll only tap for one color, and they always come in tapped. Now, there's still the Bolt lands, both from the Modern Horizons 3 and the Mythics from Zendikar Rising, that come in untapped for 3 life, but they are also still tapping for 1 mana. Whereas the 2-color ones, which we have quite a few of, well, as many as we can, come in for 2 colors, but still have the problem that they always come in tapped. This generates a deck that is particularly slow. And with that in mind, I've been trying to make decisions to make up for this slowness and make the most bang for our buck in terms of our ability to cast our spells. Namely, at a glance, you can tell as much as I could, I have avoided putting many mana pips into spells. Obviously, cards like War of Invention and I think also Supreme Verdict are the only ones with 3 pips, but they're particularly strong cards for a deck like this. Otherwise, I'm just trying to hold out on that idea of reducing the number of pips if possible. It's just not very feasible, especially early game. With that in mind, I also brought in, especially in enchantments, instants, and sorceries, a lot of cards that I personally think are rather strong without being overpowering for a deck like this. I'm talking about cards like Mystic Remora, cards like Black Market Connections, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Smothering Tithe, of course. And then over here, you know, a number of really good 1-mana removal spells, from Dispatch to Pongify to Swords to Plowshares, Rapid Hybridization. These are strong cards, and I particularly like them here because it is just difficult to get the mana that we need in large amounts, and especially early in game, I want to be able to cast spells and do things while I'm continuing to play a tapped land each turn. Continuing the mana situation, for those who have already looked at the artifacts, you will notice that I have a lot of mana rocks. From Soul Ring to Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet, and then the entirety of the Talisman collection that we have access to, we have a lot of mana. I've even done something I almost never do, and I added Chromatic Lantern, which is, of course, in a deck that is locked to a lot of lands that only tap for 1 color. Chromatic Lantern fixes a very, very big problem that we have in fixing our mana while also producing its own mana. I don't love that I have to play this. I don't particularly like Chromatic Lantern, but if I've ever seen an argument for Chromatic Lantern, this is it right here. We need to be able to get to high mana and effective mana as fast as possible. So being able to play our kind of subpar lands in an order to give us access to mana, to just drop talismans, to play Felwar Stones, and at least to be able to do something early is going to be crucial. Getting to 4 mana for us is like getting to 6 mana for other decks, so we have to be very, very much so in the mindset of artifact-based ramp, which on that point is a good moment to add what I thought was a good direction to pull the deck in. See, I thought of a lot of ways you can build this deck. It has a very, very wide power arc of like how strong you can make it, and I'll get into a little bit more of that in a moment, but when it came to like what I wanted to do that I thought would be effective is I looked for like treasure packages. I wanted to play as many treasure cards as I could, because not only are treasures very strong and very effective, they're also the cards that allow us to ramp faster and do something in the middle game while we are building towards our very, very fun one-shot Goblin Charbelcher. So I'm talking about cards like using the Big Score Unexpected Windfall. I'm talking about cards such as the Academy Manufactor, like nothing too crazy. This is the kind of thing that you could go a lot more into and have a lot stronger treasure builders, but I wanted to just put a little bit here and there to keep that power level within a reasonable sense. Black Market Connections and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, I mentioned these earlier. These are very, very powerful cards in every way that they work, but specifically they're also here just to generate a little more treasure. And all that treasure works really, really well, of course, with Breya, who can use 2 of that treasure and 2 additional mana to use her abilities. When treasure is in much more abundance, you can, you know, use this ability a lot more. And when they're not in abundance, you can use her ability to sacrifice these talismans and mana rocks that we are inundated with. Speaking of this kind of sacrifice mechanic, I wanted to put a few cards in here that I thought would work really well with Breya, with the sacrifice mechanic, and once again, buy us time in the middle game so we can build towards our win. I'm talking about cards like Ichor Wellspring. I don't think this class of cards has like a nickname or something. I'm going to call them the Wellspring because I think Michaeloth Wellspring is the other one. But these Wellspring artifacts all have the kind of ability that when they enter or go into the graveyard, they have an effect. So Ichor Wellspring draws you us a card. Mephitic Drought also draws us a card, but for a life. Prize Statue creates a treasure token. And there are a few others that generate creatures, and I didn't want to use those, but you can. And there's also, I said earlier, Mycosynth Wellspring, but that looks for a basic land from your deck, so unfortunately it is not on the table for our deck. These cards, of course, work well with a few other sacrifice enablers, such as Tarian's Journal, which can sacrifice an artifact each turn in order to draw you a card, and it itself does transform into a land if needed. This, of course, as well can sacrifice the treasure tokens you're making, so I do really like Tarian's Journal here. Likewise, Goblin Engineer is just very, very good to not only tutor an artifact into your graveyard, but also be able to kind of shuffle artifacts around. If you could get like Ichor Wellspring and Mephitic Drought both in like one on the battlefield, one in your graveyard, and just use Goblin Engineer to like cycle them. For 1 red mana, you are drawing 2 cards and losing 1 life every time you do this. And I think that's really, really good. Not even including the way you can use this on other artifacts for like value plays or reanimating some creatures that have gone away. Mirror Retriever, though not exactly the same thing, works kind of similarly to these Wellspring artifacts that when it dies, it returns something from your graveyard to your hand. And especially once again with the Goblin Engineer, you can make that circle, get you a lot of card advantage very, very quickly. Speaking of damage through that card advantage, we have cards like Marionette Apprentice and Reckless Fireweaver that just stand around to just do a little bit of damage here and there as your deck is going off. I don't particularly think this is going to win you a game, but the damage you will do is meaningful. I think there should be more of a conversation in Commander about incidental damage as politics. When you start knocking down your opponents for 3 to 4 life a turn, yes, it does make you a threat, but it does change your opponent's options, especially if you are otherwise unthreatening. If you are like behind and you just like use an effect that deals 4 damage to each of your opponents that are more worried about another player, like someone who's very much in the lead, might see that extra reach you gave them into their life total to be valuable to maybe take riskier plays or go for all-out attacks. I think this is valuable and pretty important, though it is kind of tricky because I will admit that players are easily distracted by the amount of damage what you can do and not the amount of damage you will do, right? The potential is always much more scary than the actual case. Coming back to what I would say is the Charbelcher plan, there's a few cards here that I think are really, really good. Now, generally, I've avoided some tutors here, and we'll get back to that, but I wanted to use cards such as Whir of Invention as a tutor. I wanted to use Kuldotha Forgemaster as a tutor because I, and maybe you would disagree, see these as particularly fair tutors. You can't get much fairer than Kuldotha Forgemaster, a 5-mana creature that needs you to untap and then sacrifice 3 artifacts to tutor an artifact directly on the battlefield, which is generally used to get like Blightsteel Colossus and the like. Here, it just gets Charbelcher, which is very, very good, but still a lot of work to do. So if you manage to pull this off, I don't think I'm even mad. I think that's pretty impressive. Like, your opponents should have interacted with you on a number of different points, so if they've let you do this, you've earned it. Likewise, with the Charbelcher, I also wanted a few cards that could work with it, such as Forensic Gadgeteer, that would just reduce the activated ability by a little bit. Going from 7 mana to play and activate to 6 mana to play and activate may not seem like a big deal, but I think it's particularly important, especially if you consider the fact that our ability to use treasures to pay for it can enable us to be casting Charbelcher out very, very early. Of course, Forensic Gadgeteer is very good as a investigate outlet and also works well with a number of artifacts we already have that have abilities that we want to reduce the cost of. I say a lot, but now that I think about it, probably less than I'm giving credit. Regardless, I like that kind of mix, and I have a few cards here also that I want to bring attention to that are meant to give a bit of recursion to this deck, as the deck, I think, has a weakness to certain mill strategies or certain discard strategies or removal on the Charbelcher that puts it into a position that it can't quite get back from. So I wanted to play cards such as Jailbreak, such as Archaeomender, which brings back an artifact. Two very notable ones that I really like are Fortuitous Find and Remember the Fallen. Cards with exact same text, except for the order of the 2 points is reversed for some reason. These cards either get you an artifact card or a creature card, or both, which is particularly strong in this deck. I did think of maybe adding some self-mill. I mean, Search for Askantha is the closest thing that we have, and I do believe also, where are we? The Everflowing Well will also do very, very limited, but self-mill nonetheless. These are things worth considering if you wanted to go into more self-mill. Play this as a bit of an artifact reanimator deck is definitely something you can do. That being said, I did want to have one more kind of, let's say, problem-solving card should someone be using a Rest in Peace. Actually, Rest in Peace effect probably wouldn't work, but another exile effect. We do have Pull from Eternity here, a card I particularly like as a one-of, well, I mean, it's Commander, most cards are one-ofs, as a one way to fix an unsolvable problem. Pull for Eternity will take your Charbelcher from the exile and put it into your graveyard, hopefully allowing you to reanimate it as soon as possible and get the ability. Now, there's some really weird, cheeky things you can do with this card, and we're not going to do that, but know that it's here just to fix the problem. And that problem, I don't know how often it's going to be. I don't know how often someone's going to fare well at instant speed or something of the like, but it's worth considering, and having a main deck answer is something I think you will appreciate. That being said, looking around, there's a bunch of cards that I also think are just kind of fun and interesting that I wanted to take a moment to point out. Obviously, Manifold Key and Galactic Key allow you to untap the Charbelcher and take out multiple opponents in one turn. This is particularly strong, and if your opponents allow you to get to this point of the game, where you have Charbelcher ready to go and like Galactic Key, it's Voltaic, I know that, but I'm going to still mispronounce it a bunch. I think your opponents have lost the game and they haven't been able to stop you, and that win is particularly easy. I don't think there's any problem with that at all. Going down here, Wonderscape Sage is a card that really got me going. I really think this is the coolest card in the deck. It is a Moonfolk card that is a reference to the way Moonfolk used to work. For those who played the original Kamigawa, they might remember Moonfolk's ability, or like, let's say their Kindred ability, was to return lands from your battlefield to your hand. There was another mechanic in it called Sweep. These were bad mechanics. This was a bad idea. I don't know what they were thinking. Nobody ever wants to put lands from their battlefield back in their hand because it's so valuable for them to stay on the battlefield. Unless you wanted those cards back in your hand because you could cast them as spells. Though this isn't something I think is crazy important, a number of our cards are not very strong. Something like Black Bloom Rogue is not something you're really going to cast as a 2/3 for 3. However, spells like Malakir Rebirth or spells like the Jwari Disruption are very good spells, in fact, not even including things like Sink into Stupor, very strong card, or the Fell the Profane. These cards are very strong and can do a lot for you, and being able to return them from their land side to your hand, especially the instant spells, to then immediately use them, is really impressive. Especially if we look at things like the very high mana ones like Amaria's Call, Ondu Inversion, Seagate Restoration. Even Blood-Soaked Insight is a card I really like, and having access to them again is really cool. The other thing about the Wonderscape Sage is something that I wanted to point out in Versus. We're not even going to the ability yet, but just the cost is, back in the day, these Moonfolk, the mana cost to do this was 2 to 3 mana generally, except for the legendary creature, which was 5 mana to cast and 1 mana to bounce lands. not very good. So Wonderscape Sage being a tap ability is really, really good. Like, I really like how cheap this is to do, and the fact that it's at instant speed. Then reading the ability itself, that's draw a card, then discard a card unless that land had a non-basic land type. Now, as far as I can tell, you know what, non-basic land type, that probably means like sphere and those kind of things. Let me look this up. So what the ability means is that if your land has a non-basic type, that's like desert, cave, Urza's I think is one, sphere, those kind of land types, that's a non-basic land type, then you'll get the effect. Our lands do not have types, they're just non-basics, so we won't get this ability. So Wonderscape Sage. Another card that really catches my eye that I've been wanting to play is Into the Pit. Into the Pit allows you to cast spells off the top of your deck if you sacrifice a non-land permanent in addition to paying their other costs. This is the first time I think that black really gets this ability, and this is a very, very strong ability, especially at 3 mana when usually this is 4 or 5 mana to do this. I think this is also very strong in a deck that wants to sacrifice artifacts or has treasure tokens, and the ability to just cast a few spells off the top of your deck is going to be impressive. Of course, the only problem with this is it doesn't let you play lands off the top of your deck, so you cannot get the backside of these cards. Even then, I think it's interesting and worth playing with, and it's been on my mind, so I wanted to throw it in there. Otherwise, looking at the rest of the deck, a lot of it is very, very straightforward. I've got some board clears here to protect the deck, some more reanimation, Dawn's Truce to protect us, a Ghirapur Aether Grid, which is just really, really strong here, and that in of itself is kind of the whole deck. But I want to talk a bit, and I said I would come back to this, is the concept of power level in a deck like this. And the power level I want to talk about is how easily this deck scales on the either direction of how strong you wanted this to be. So for example, a version of this deck that I was thinking of, and I was very profoundly thinking of, was one that uses the Mir or the Mirror, the small like robots on Mirrodin. I guess they're Mir because it's Mirrodin. So the Mir as just like a kindred deck where you're just playing a Mir deck that just happens to have Goblin Charbelcher as a win condition. Now, partially why I really like the Mir is because most of them have like the ability to tap for mana, which fills into this kind of slot I have here with all of these mana rocks. So you could take out all the talismans and just start playing, starting with the 4 Mirror of each color, then the colorless Mirror, then the 2 toxic Mirror or the 2 infect Mirror, and then higher mana Mirror tap for any color. That's already a huge chunk of creatures that are just in your colors, and you get to play with the benefit of, having this kind of pseudo aggro deck that makes up for the fact that all your lands come in tapped. The other thing to follow up with that would be that this becomes an aggro deck that just so happens to have this like laser beam win condition, which is not the only laser beam that like Mirror have access to. There's like from the Mirror deck, there was something that says if you have like 30 or more counters, you get to deal 10 damage to each opponent. There's the old style, like every time you put a charge counter, and then like every 3 charge counters you destroy a permanent. These kind of like charge up effects are really common in a deck like this, and so you get multiple ways to use this giant super laser attack that Goblin Charbelcher ends up being a part of, and not necessarily the deck's namesake. Another benefit is that you can use cards like Legion's Leadership. That means a lot more in a deck that isn't just using this for Breya. However, this whole thing goes the other way too. If you wanted to strengthen this deck, well, the easiest thing to do is to just put more tutor spells. The ability to put Goblin Charbelcher into your hand at any given time is going to be the big difference of how quickly you win against your opponents. I would probably take out a lot of the cuter sacrifice stuff and the treasure stuff and just focus on counter magic, silence spells, tutors to set up one really powerful turn where you slam down the Goblin Charbelcher, take out an opponent on end step, untap, akin to reloading and firing again, taking out another player. and then putting yourself in a position where you're one-on-one and they have one turn to stop you. And hopefully that you're holding up counter magic to stop them. But that's also not everyone's cup of tea. So this current build is trying to like thread the line in the middle between those two kind of plans, and I think it does a pretty good job at that. Coming to the end, I did want to talk about another set of commanders you could use. The Wernog Bjorna combination, I think, is particularly strong in here. Of course, it's the same color combination of everything but green, but you have two 2-mana creatures that are both particularly strong and work in this deck particularly well. Wernog is both a really good artifact generation and sack target, like sacrifice fodder, and Bjorna is a wonderful sacrifice enabler, an aristocrat that not only is very, very strong at making use of extra treasure tokens or extra abilities to sacrifice just artifacts you want to go in the graveyard, but can sow discord with really, really good goad attacks, goad targets for goad attacks, and at the same time you can ping down some creatures like Esper Sentinel that often just need to die. The other reason I didn't want to suggest them as the main commanders is that partner commanders can be seen as a little contentious. They are very, very strong, but also they are two commanders that you don't always see. So I thought Breya was the safer bet, but if you were asking me which one I find stronger, I would say the Wernog Bjorna is much, much more powerful. Either way, the Goblin Charbelcher deck is immensely powerful, and I think there's a lot of different ways you can build it. This is my version. I'd love to hear what people think. I know I've probably missed some things, but I was having a lot of fun times building this deck, and even though I did pick quite a few cards that I think are just generically strong, such as the removal package or the inclusion of Smothering Tide, I found the rest of it really, really fun to kind of build around and think about. I think if you are interested in this deck, but you want to change it and find a different version, this is very, very possible. Plus, it'll give you something for you to do with all these MDFCs that you have laying around. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much, Lexa, for sending the deck request. I think it was a blast to make. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.